Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Coach's Corner. I'm Jeffrey David Hartford, your host and the coach. That's the conduit of optimism, altruism, consciousness, and health. And if you recall, it was actually 2 weeks ago today, I was fortunate enough to have Dr. Thomas Seeger on. And in that conversation, he mentioned to me the name Dean Hall and told me he would be a great guy to have on based on his story. And that story we will be getting into today because I am fortunate enough to bring to you Mr. Dean Hall. Dean, thanks so much for being here with us today.
Hey, Jeffrey, I can't wait to get into this, and I really appreciate you having me on your show.
Amen, man. Yeah, I'm very grateful for it. And, I had the opportunity to read your book and get to know your story a little bit better than what Dr. Seeger kind of glossed over briefly.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to tell you that I see the reason he recommended having you on. And, to say I'm touched by your story would be a total understatement. As I read through the way your daughter writes, I'll start by saying that if you haven't done it yet, you've got to get your hands on a copy of this. It's called The Wild Cure. And it's Dean's story as written by his daughter, Bree. And right. I felt like I was on the Willamette with you, swimming it, experiencing it. It's remarkable. So for those that might not be familiar with your story, let's jump in, man.
Sure.
The diagnosis with leukemia, with lymphoma, with backstory on your wife, and man, all of it. Let's see where you want to take us, and I'll throw it to you, man.
Okay. Well, I mean, usually a good story starts at the beginning. So I was raised here in Oregon in the Pacific Northwest. I tell everyone I was raised by wolves because both my parents were mountain climbers. And back in the 60s, women were supposed to stay at home and cook and wear pearls. But that just wasn't my mom. She was this cute little Swede and could have done any of those things, but she wanted to be out there with my dad climbing mountains. And so for me, it was an idyllic childhood. When everybody else was stuck inside in the rain on a weekend, watching the Scooby-Doo marathon, I was climbing Mount Hood, the tallest mountain in Oregon, or many of the other Cascades along the West Coast. And so really it was just a fantastic way to grow up, especially for an ADHD kid like me. I was out there running in the woods and swimming across alpine lakes and climbing mountains, not stuck inside, never been really good indoors, and had a real affinity for nature. And it was really curated and groomed by my parents. But then soccer took over. About 12 or 13, I fell in love with the sport because I found it was the one sport where coaches couldn't tell me what to do. I tell everybody, once you get to learn this sport, it's this perfect blend of hard physicality with geometry combined with chess, because you're always watching how things are going and trying to create triangles, and it's so fast moving. Coaches can tell you the principles, but I just hated playing American football because, run a pattern. If it doesn't make sense, why are you doing it? And so I just fell in love with the sport. And I saw an old guy not too long ago, probably younger than me, wearing a shirt that said, "The older I get, the better I was." And that kind of sums up my soccer career. But I was on a Olympic development team. The first Nike, shows you how old I am, the first Nike sponsored team. And they took us to England, and we thought we were the best of the best. We were so cocky. And then they took us over to England, and we played under several Premier League reserves. We played under Wolverhampton, Birmingham, Liverpool, and then Manchester United in their heyday. And we looked like Bobo the Dancing Bear compared to these guys. And so I see that. I mean, there were many reasons that was a wonderful experience, but the biggest of which is at 16 years old, going from thinking I'm the best to having a real legitimate ego check, I think was really important in my development. But anyway, so I had several full ride scholarships around the US. And on a lark, because I'm essentially such a nerd, I picked Kansas. Because I'd never known anyone that had ever been there. And it's right in the middle. And if you know about history, and I'm such a history nerd, I knew it had a lot to do with Native Americans and the start of the Civil War, Bleeding Kansas, John Brown, and all of that. And so I
Mm.
thought, hey, let them pay me. I'll go play soccer for this little college. It won't be really any high quality soccer, but it'll get me my first year credits out of the way, and I'll travel to Dodge City and different places and just soak up the history. Well, what I didn't factor in is life taking a hand. And I met this cute little Kansas farm girl that grabbed my heart and just captured it in a moment. And so I went back a second year, and then boy, she really had me hooked. And so I told all my friends that I was putting myself in exile for love, because she said, hey, you came out here and I'm close to my family too. I didn't go out to Oregon. So if you love,
Mhm.
I love you, but if you want to live with me, it's going to be here. And so I came back for a while, and the beauty of Oregon just wasn't that beautiful anymore. And so without her,
Mm.
so I made that commitment. Okay, let's do this. And I'll live in your tiny little rural town of 12,000 people just 4 miles from the Oklahoma border, deep in the heart of redneckery. And I had a great time. Other than nobody ever called me by
Nice.
name, I was always Mary's husband. Because if your grandparents didn't grow up there, you were an outsider, and God forbid you were from the West Coast. That made you really suspicious. So, so I lived there. I taught for 20 years because I just loved kids and loved coaching. My first 3 years actually were in Dodge City, Kansas, and they were miserable. And so we literally got out of Dodge and went to her hometown. And then I taught the next 17 years in her hometown. And the heartache and the brokenness and the wounds of the students that I taught, and then even the other teachers and
Mm.
parents, really made me want to become a therapist. And so for
Mm.
13 years, first, the first three, I went to school at night and got my master's in family therapy. And then for the next 10, I teach during the day and do therapy at night, building a private practice. And so that was all really good. We were doing what good Americans are brainwashed into doing, and that is working really hard and piling up a mountain of money and buying a nice house and nice cars and, silly things like that, or what seems silly to me now, because I was just working
Yeah.
around the clock. Yeah. Yeah. And so by 2007, I was only working as a therapist for 5 years. 5 years earlier, I'd quit teaching because I was so busy as a therapist in my private practice. And 4 days before Christmas in 2006, uh, I had gotten in a terrible soccer accident, had a terrible injury. I'd gone in for a slide tackle my senior year, and a big guy fell on my leg close to my knee, and I was going so fast, I came all the way over on top of him, literally hyperextended my knee exactly backwards, dislocated
Oh.
my kneecap, uh, tore every tendon and ligament in my knee. I was just trash. And I would have been, if I hadn't been so young, I would have been immediately a candidate for a total knee replacement. But this is the 80s, and the knee replacements were still just kind of steel, and they weren't very good. They were really clunky, and they only had about a 10 to 15-year life on them, timestamp. And so they wanted
Mhm.
me to wait till the technology got better, and I was a little older. So finally, I waited for 20 years for this knee replacement. And it had gotten to the point where the pain was so bad, I was limping around most of the time. So I was really excited to get this knee replacement. And what I'd done to keep my knee in place is I'd done a lot of bicycling, fell in love with the sport, and it kind of built up the muscles to kind of keep my knee together. And never really been sick. They told me I had to go in for a blood test for surgery, pre-surgical blood work. So I went in, and living in this small town, having been a teacher, almost all the entry level positions around town were kids I taught. And
Mm-hmm.
so this sweet young lady who I'd had about 10 years earlier as a 12-year-old drew my blood, and we talked and kind of caught up. And then a couple of days later, they called me back and they said, "Hey, Dean, your blood test came back bad. You need to come in and we need to take it again." Well, I'd never been sick,
Mm-hmm.
Jeffrey. So my first thought was, oh, this poor sweet little girl had somehow fouled the blood test. And so my immediate
Yeah.
response was, "Hey, don't get Jasmine in trouble. It's okay. That's no problem." And the nurse is like, "What?" I'm like, "Don't get anybody in trouble. I'll just come right back in. It's no problem at all." And she's like, "Your blood test came back bad." I'm like, "I know. I know it's probably frustrating for you, but it's okay." And she's like, "Huh?" She's like, "No, come back in." I'm like, "Okay." And so I did. And they drew, the first time they just drew, I think it was 2 vials. This time it was like 8. And I'm still sitting there talking to another student that I'd had. "Hey, be real careful this time. It came back bad. I don't want you to get in trouble." And they're looking at me like, "What?" Okay. I still didn't clue in. And then that night,
Yeah.
the chief of staff, who had become one of my best friends over the last 10 years earlier, showed up at my office as I was finishing at about 10 p.m. And this wasn't unusual because he had a lot of stress. And so, as a
Mm-hmm.
therapist, meditation teacher, and clinical hypnotherapist, I'd kind of induce hypnosis, let him rant and rave, and kind of give him images to kind of decompress, and probably about 2 or 3 times a month. So that's what I thought he was doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Hey, Aaron, what are you doing?" He's like, "Man, we got to talk." And I thought, uh-oh, because I heard the urgency in his voice. And my first thought was, he's being sued for malpractice or something. I thought, uh-oh, he's in real
Mm-hmm.
trouble. And it still didn't occur that it was about me. And he's like, I said, "What can I do for you?" And he said, it's not what you can do for me. It's what I got to tell you. Let's go into your office and have you sit down. And I thought, man, this has got to be bad. I wonder what he's done. And he looked at me and he said, "Yeah, um, you've got cancer." And that just kind of passed right through me. He said, "It's acute leukemia." He said, it's acute and chronic both. And I've sent it out to
Mm.
several of my favorite oncologists, some of the best in the field. They've never seen anything like it. It's a very serious, life threatening condition. And he paused and looked at me. And all I could think of was, and I didn't thankfully say it out loud, was, "Oh, good, you're not in trouble." And then it was like, I almost heard the sound effect of a car stopping fast, you know,
Yep.
wait, what? Wait a minute. I said, "What did you say?" And he says, "Dean, you've got cancer. It's life threatening." And he went over it all again. And I said, "Well, I know nobody gives life expectancies anymore, but if you could, Aaron, as a good friend, what would you say?" And he's like, 4 to 6 weeks tops if this thing doesn't turn around.
Mm.
And then it really hit just like a hammer blow, because my daughter at that time was 14 years old. And I don't know if you've hung around 14-year-old girls, but they really need their dads. So I thought, I
Yep.
can't leave her
Mine's
at
15.
14. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was four
Amen,
days
man.
before
Yeah.
Christmas, 2006. Thankfully, in a couple weeks, it settled down to chronic lymphocytic leukemia, which, according to allopathic medicine, is never supposed to go away. Just the numbers can go down. It's not really in remission, but it's what they call manageable. And
Yeah.
it took about a year and a half for me to get to that state, but I finally did.
That's awesome. Now, so that first time, not to give away the rest of the story now, but how did it go down at that point? Did they treat it, or was it stuff that you had
No,
been doing on your
no,
own?
I didn't take chemo or radiation. They wanted to immediately, as is the tradition. But I
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm stubborn or headstrong, uh, but
Uh-huh.
or I like to
Maybe
think
both.
of it as thinking, deep thinking. But I'd had so many of my clients come through that had had cancer, and I walked through that journey with them. And immediately they did chemo and radiation. And sometimes they're like, I don't even know if I need this thing. And sometimes they do it for preventative measures. And I'm like, what? You're taking poison
Yeah.
that was developed as biological warfare at the start of World War II. You're taking that to for preventive. It just didn't make sense. But I would keep
Yep.
those thoughts to myself, of course. And even if it turned out really well, they'd have nearly lifelong side effects afterwards that would last for years, if not the rest of their life, like neuropathy and hardening of the arteries. The thing I was worried about the most was brain fog, because the only thing I've ever really been real proud of myself is I can think pretty well. And I didn't want to,
Mm.
that was one of my strengths. I didn't want to lose that. And so I thought, and the other way I put it to my oncologist at the very first is, hey, no disrespect intended, but this is my body, and I've got to be the boss of my body. And you are a very caring man, and you're very educated. You know way more than I'm ever going to know, but I am going to be the manager. You're going to be my coach. You're going to be my consultant, but ultimately it's my right to choose what we do. And he
Yeah.
looked at me and he said, I've never had anyone say that to me before. And I said, hey, I'm not trying to be disrespectful. And if you can't work like that, that's fine. I'll have you refer me. But it's got to be that way, because I see, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I see chemo and radiation like an atom bomb. It's what you do when all other strategies have failed. And you don't start a battle with an atom bomb. You start it,
Mm.
intelligently with maybe a few skirmishes or something. And he said, well, I've never thought about it like that, but I would agree that that's probably a good approach. And I said, so unless it's absolutely life threatening and my numbers are way up again, let's save chemo and radiation for the last ditch effort. And he agreed. And so that's what we did.
Wow.
And what I did, Jeffrey, was all the typical lifestyle protocols. I cleaned up my diet because I was living in the Midwest. So I was eating heavy gravies and fried food and lots of sugar and drinking that sweet tea all the time. And even drinking, now
Yep.
I think about it and it kind of makes me throw up in my mouth a little bit, but drinking sodas all the time, 3 or 4
Yeah.
sodas a day, that kind of thing. So I got rid of all that. And then I'm so ADHD, it used to drive my folks crazy. I can get 3 or 4 hours of sleep and I'm good to go. And, and
Mm.
they always, they were kind of particular. They always wanted 8 or 9 hours of sleep. And I'm like, what's the deal? But I forced myself to start trying to get 8 or 9 hours, even 10 hours of sleep a night. Um, and that was a hard habit to develop at first. But it was, all the research says that's when your body restores and rejuvenates. So it's those kinds of
That's right.
protocols. Started drinking good water and a lot of it. So did those kinds of, started taking lipospheric vitamin C, all
Hmm.
those kinds of things, and mostly just resting. And I reduced my workload from about 80 to 100 hours a week to about 40 or 50. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That, what goes through my mind too, as you were telling the story at the beginning, being a kid and, saying ADD, ADHD, which may very well be true, may very well have been diagnosed, but I have the sense that that's being diagnosed more and more and more these days. But we've got so many things in our food, so many preservatives, so many dyes, and sugar is everywhere as if it's a food, but it's really just a drug. There's no nutrients that are coming from it. There's
Right.
calories and it's a carbohydrate, as we call it. But man, we're just drugged. And then overreacting to the fact that this poor kid now won't sit down, shut up, and stay still in school, so they must have a problem. Let's label them. But
Right.
by nature, what you had, and God bless your parents, man, like being outdoors, being active, that's exactly what we need, especially little boys. We see that it's very easy to diagnose and label somebody with this condition that can then be treated with a medication when, well, if we just remove the culprit, the drug that we're putting in to begin with, and then give the boys the opportunity to get outside, get into nature, and let their body live, you
Right.
know? And that's like the overriding theme I have with your story. I keep thinking about it's like the period of time that you had where you left Oregon, went to Kansas, and although you absolutely made the best situation of it, it seems to me that you left who it is that you are at the core. You weren't as outdoor, as active, stuck indoors working because you were so damn good at it, which God bless you for it. But, you were no longer living life. And, it's really interesting. Like, I don't want to compare my situation to yours because there are enough differences. But the reason Dr. Seeger suggested I have you on, I believe, is because I was telling him about my story of my diagnosis of a tumor on my left kidney. And, upon my diagnosis, I had this rush of energy through my body of pure peace and calm. I knew in
Mm.
that moment I was going to be fine. I knew it was not going to be through standard of care treatment. The way the doctors put it is he said it's more likely than not that it's cancer. So we don't know
Okay.
for sure. It could be benign. Who knows? But my sense was either way, it's my body's going to be able to take care of this because I'm going to give my body the stimulus and the environment it needs to heal itself. And I believe wholeheartedly that's what it's capable of. You touched upon the lifestyle you were leading and what you were eating. I did that in my youth, but I no longer do that. So I
Right.
have this strange sense that the diagnosis I recently received, this was just back in June,
Okay.
that was for a previous version of me that
Mm.
is no longer here. He already died. And I'm
Mm.
I'm a new version of myself living a different lifestyle that is necessary to heal this. And I
Right.
think that's exactly the story that you've got, although it was a different diagnosis, that's exactly what you've done. So now you went the initial diagnosis, the numbers were up so high, they were talking 4 to 6 weeks, and then you change your life and you see your body resolve and things come back down. So where does that bring us now? Was it around that time that Mary got her diagnosis?
No, I had, well, I almost died in 2008. I got pneumonia and my immune system was so suppressed, it took me down. And I woke up. It was the first time I woke up in the hospital, and the doctors looked at me and said, "Whoa, you almost didn't make it." That's happened to me three
Wow.
times. It's always a bit unsettling when you wake up in a hospital,
Yeah.
didn't know you got there, and they say you almost didn't make it. But
Wow.
I really struggled to come back, became very fit, became much more um, conscientious about eating and lifestyle, spending time outside, especially on my bike. And I started swimming again, even though it was in a pool. But yeah, I started taking even better care of myself. 2009 just rocked. It was really great. Then we're into 2000, summer of 2010, and right around mid July, mid to late July, Mary got sick, and they thought it was pneumonia. And in that
Mm,
little rural area, that's not unusual because there's, after harvest, there's so much wheat dust in the air, so many pesticides, and it's so hot, so much dust
yeah.
that your lungs get compromised and you end up with pneumonia. And And so she just laid on the couch for a couple weeks, and she was the picture of health. Like me, she never really ever got sick, but unlike me, I call myself ADHD, but I'm not what I would call a bundle of energy. That girl only had two speeds, extremely fast and asleep, and there was no in between. One of her cousins said that Mary could create world peace before she could get her shoes on. And that's kind of who she was. I mean, talk about the Energizer Bunny on crack. And so it was really odd to see her listless. And then her
Mm.
face dropped on the right side. And that really alarmed us. And so we got her into the hospital, and they got us into an MRI. And as soon as the MRI was done, Dr. Waters called me. We were 60 miles away from home because we had, we lived, of course, there wasn't an MRI in our little town. So we had to drive 60 miles up to Wichita, Kansas. And I thought, if he's calling me this close after the MRI, it can't be good news. And he's like, hey, are you sitting down? And I thought, oh, geez, here we go again. And I'm like, no, I'm in the car. And he's like, well, when you get home, let me know. I'll pop on over. I'm like, no, you're not going to make me wait for an hour for this news. And he said, well, okay, I don't want to tell you while you're driving. I said, I got to know. He said, Mary's got one of the largest brain tumors they've ever seen. It's very aggressive, and typically it's operable proportionately to how high in the brain it is and how far forward. And hers is all the way back and down around the brainstem, and it's got a lot of fingers. And so he was on the KU Board of Medicine, so he called in some favors for one of the top neurosurgeons in the world who lived in Kansas City. And he said, I'm going to get you guys in to see him as soon as possible. Be ready. She might go into immediate surgery. And so we were, and we ran up there September 2nd of 2010. And he took one look at the film. By this time, only days later, Mary's not even walking. She lost total control of her right side. And so she's in a wheelchair, and he's like, if you could roll her out, I just want to talk to you. So I did. And he
Mm.
pointed out where it was, and he said, even with laser guided surgery, there's an 80% chance we'd nick a blood vessel and she'd bleed out on the table, or we'd hit a nerve and she'd be a quadriplegic the rest of her life. And even if we took those chances, there's only probably a 50% a chance that we could get 50% of the tumor. And I said, okay, let's say it all goes perfectly. What's best case scenario? And he said, we get 50, maybe 60% of the tumor. We don't nick anything. And then we send you down to MD Anderson for massive amounts of chemo and radiation. I said, well, then does she have a chance of going into remission? He said, no, absolutely not. It would just extend her life by maybe 6 months to a year. I said, what kind of life would that be? And he said, well, imagine having a terrible case of the flu and a migraine all at the same time. I said, well, we're not doing that. I said, what if we don't do anything? And he said, well, she'll continue to sleep more and more, lose her capacities and her capabilities more and more, and then she'll die in her sleep, probably in 6 months. And 52 days later, she died. 15 days to our 30th anniversary. And it was devastating. Yeah.
That's heavy, man.
Yeah, it was.
I listened to your conversation with Dr. Seeger on the Morosco
Yeah.
podcast, and that's where I had heard that the first time. And I knew some of your story. I didn't know that. And man, my condolences still
Oh,
to this
thank you.
day. I know a lot of time goes by, but it never changes. And that's heartbreaking. It's,
Well, it does change, thankfully. I mean, it was super traumatic, and it was absolutely horrible. But like you found, Jeffrey, if you face things, the secret is becoming a wild human again, being much more connected with earth, with nature, and with its power to heal. But I don't think we're meant to do that how we're currently doing that, encouraging people to do that as therapists and coaches. We've got to do that inside community, but we've also got to do that out of these concrete jungles. We've got to get back to where we're supposed to be. And by choosing to not run from that pain, you're right, I could be still there and it would have never changed. But by choosing to face it, when we face things, then we find ways to overcome them. We heal and grow. And the Buddhists have a formula: bad things happen plus you face them equals maturity. And I hope I'd become a little more mature. Jury's out, maybe.
Yeah,
But
man. That's
yeah, so it's thankfully, I mean, when she died, I'd never really cried before in my life. Not really, never really had an occasion to. I mean, I'd gone through a lot of difficult things, but nothing tragic or traumatic. And the ironic thing is, I was considered a grief expert in the Midwest. I'd done many seminars on it, served hundreds of people grieving, written articles for newspapers and magazines. But when it happened, I realized experientially, I knew nothing. It was way harder than anything I ever imagined. I had always imagined what would it be like having gone through it with so many others. Thought I knew how I'd respond. I didn't factor in the loss of emotional control. I couldn't even talk about the weather.
mm,
I couldn't, from the time she died, I could not say her name until after the Willamette swim. For 4 years, I couldn't even say Mary without crying. Um, it was just, and I look back on it now and I understand why there are many factors, and I don't want to take all the time, but one of the most insidious was in this tiny little town, since I was an outsider, even though I taught there for 17 years, even though I was a therapist there for 20, uh, my grandparents didn't grow up there. So when people would see me, even after 30 years, they'd be like, hey, there's Mary's husband. And at first, it really was annoying the first couple of years, but I got used to it. And it was a good gig. So I was like, yeah, I'm Mary's husband. But I didn't realize how insidiously that had formed my adult identity. And so then all of a sudden, I'm not Mary's husband. Who the hell am I? And what am I doing?
mm,
I was lost, just absolutely lost. And as is true, they're finding out now many cancer diagnoses, particularly blood cancers, happen about 1 year after a trauma. And
mm.
1 year, 2011, almost to the day Mary died, the leukemia came back with a vengeance. The numbers went through the roof. And this time it brought with it lymphoma. I had about 60 or 70 lymph nodes that just went crazy all over my body, especially right under my jaw. They puffed way up to the point where I could hardly turn my neck. And then I had one under my right armpit. My doctor lovingly called my hockey puck because it was the size and shape of a hockey puck under my left arm. So
Wow.
it was just bad. And I got down to 100, and I'm 6'1", and a half. Right now I'm pretty fit. I'm about 10-11% body fat, and I weigh 215. At that time, I got down to 152 pounds. I was
Wow.
skeletal. Yeah. I was really sick.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it's interesting that that response of yours started with me saying how heavy it was and how things don't change, and I really appreciate your take on that. And it's interesting, in these kinds of conversations, I really like a little bit of back and forth without it just being oh, here's a question, there's your response, here's another question. So at the risk of trying to sound like I'm making it about me, what I'll
No,
say
make
is
it about you.
in
Yeah,
January of
let's
22, I lost my, well, it's a nice
yeah.
exchange, right? Back in January of 22, I lost mom, and back in March of this year, I lost dad. And they
Wow.
were far younger than I anticipated losing them. Mom was 65, dad was 69.
Golly.
And what I'll tell you is it was hard, as to be expected. But there's something about it. They were both going through their own challenges. Mom had surgery from an injury to her neck that wound up having complications, left her paralyzed on the left side of her body. And she was just not a very active person to begin with. And that just
Okay.
continued over the years to go downhill and downhill. And dad wound up getting diagnosed with Parkinson's and a few other things, but the Parkinson's was the big one. And, spirits were there. They were both, still with us, but over the years, you could just see the trajectory was going down. There wasn't a
Wow.
lot to get better. So when they passed, there was almost an element of relief and this sense of, well, no, they're no longer in pain. They're no longer fighting. And then when dad passed, as hard as that was, because that one came a little more as a surprise too, it was, well, hey, now they're together, so
Yeah.
much of this is about perspective and us finding a way to live. And as you said, kind of get back in touch with being alive, being an animal that's being alive, being in nature and all these different things. So, I'll pull from a conversation I heard from Dr. Michael Bernard Beckwith. He has a take that when we are born, our spirit chooses our life and our family. So we know the whole trajectory of our life. And I know some people will push back on that, but I think there's something really peaceful in that. And, thinking about from that perspective, from Mary passing when she did, she knew it was coming. And it was freeing you, even though at that point you didn't see it that way, you didn't feel it that
No.
way. It freed you to, amen, right? And how the
Right.
heck could we in that
Yeah.
moment with that level of grief? And it comes, as such a surprise. But, I think I pull from that premise quite a bit, and it made it, if dare I say, easier to go through the grieving process of losing my parents and just changing a perspective on life in general. And, I think you ended up having to go through some stuff. And as I read the story, and I've heard you tell it on a few other podcasts, it was, I'll highlight something I heard you say, and then we'll throw it to you and get your take, and we can continue the rest of your story from there
Sure.
too. But that point that it started to get so bad and you kind of just felt like, well, I've never in my life thought about taking my own life, and this wouldn't be me taking my own life. This would just be me letting nature take its course. And hey, nobody can hold that against me. I got sick and nature took its course, and well, now I'm gone and they'll be okay. And then it hit you that, well, shit, my daughter just lost her mom. She can't lose her dad too.
Right.
And that just, the way I saw that, and I mean, I felt that, man, that your spirit came to life and you discovered, what is it I have to do to keep going?
Right.
And God bless you for doing it. So
Oh, thanks.
we'll throw that to you now.
Yeah, that was a poignant moment. It was August 13th of 2013. I was down to 152 pounds, and I had made a habit for the last 3 years of not looking in the mirror. I've never been really pleased my whole life when I looked in the mirror, but during those 3 years, it just got increasingly worse. And so I had made it because when I'd look in the mirror, I didn't recognize myself. And that guy just looked, his face looked deformed. He looked unhappy. He looked so desperately sad. And that morning, I accidentally looked up and I caught my own gaze, and I just was a mess. And I couldn't believe that that
Mm.
person staring back at me was actually me. He just looked so broken. And I had the thoughts you were describing, but then it hit me. What an entirely selfish way of being and of thinking. And so, like you said, I decided I've got to do my best to make sure my daughter's not an orphan at 21, because Mary had died during her senior year in high school, which made her senior year suck. But she did. She still kept a 3.45. I don't know how. And so I had helped many people. Well, actually, what I did was I spit out a few expletives, and I said, "Man, you look like you just walked out of Auschwitz." Because you could
Mm.
see every rib, you could see my collarbone, you could see my shoulder bones for the first time since I was like 8 years old. I
Wow.
looked like those pictures you see from World War II. But then that's
Yeah.
rung a bell. I'm like, well, okay, you're feeling sorry for yourself, but hey, jerk, you didn't come out of Auschwitz. You just lost your
Right.
wife. There are a lot of people that did come out of Auschwitz, and Viktor Frankl was one of them. And I'd been a big fan and student of his, a secondhand student, read all of his books and studied his logotherapy and helped many people come back to life because what he found when he was in Auschwitz, being an Austrian psychiatrist, after a couple weeks there, he realized, oh, I wouldn't have chosen to be here, but I can study and find out firsthand what the secret is between those who overcome a terrible situation like this and those who don't. And he found that
Yep.
the better chance you have is directly equal to how passionate you are about a purpose. The more passionate you are about
Mm.
having a purpose for overcoming it, the greater your chance. And in his case, there were two main passions: one, to see their loved ones again; secondly, to kill Nazis. And so
Mm.
I thought, okay, ultimately my purpose that I'm most passionate about is living for my daughter, but I don't want her to live with a slug, some kind of loser that's just sitting on the couch watching Wheel of Fortune. No offense to those who enjoy that show, but that's not my lifestyle. Never has been, and so I didn't want it to become that. And so what I had done with others, early 2000s, the research came out that the brain, by its very nature, has to answer every question you ask. You ask a question,
Mm.
it will unconscious work on it until it finds the answer and helps it bubble up to the conscious mind. We experience that all the time with trivial things like, what was that guy's name? Hour or two later, you're brushing your teeth.
Mhm.
Oh, it's George. Or some
Mm.
kind of Jeopardy question about history or something, and it'll bounce back. But what a lot of people don't know is you can ask the most deeply meaningful, heartfelt questions, and the same process is intact. And so I started several times a day because I'd helped others do this. I thought, okay, time to apply your own medicine. I would prayerfully just center down with my whole heart and mind and ask, how could I passionately spend the rest of my life in a way that would do the world some good? And just concentrate on it with my whole heart and then let it go. And I do that about 5 times a day. Longest I'd ever had to wait or seen anybody have to wait was about 2 weeks. 6 weeks later, it's crickets still. And I'm getting really frustrated. So this one day, I'm bearing down and I almost want to cuss God or the universe or whatever you want to call that beautiful life force out because I'm not getting my answer. And I look up and I'd lived in this little duplex I was renting for the first time in 30 years, which felt like a real loss. And I look around and I'd been so depressed, I hadn't even unpacked and I'd been living there for 6 months. I hadn't even put my bed together. I was living like a
Yeah.
frat boy with a mattress on the floor. And I'm like, okay, Dean, while you're waiting for God or the universe to answer, maybe you could act like a responsible adult. Maybe put your bed together. Maybe start unpacking. And, the universe will answer. Well, anyway, so I started putting my bed together, but then I saw a box of my childhood things that my mom had prepared for me and given to me, and so I opened it up to see what was in there. And one of the first things I found was a journal I'd been forced to keep in sixth grade because, an 11-year-old boy is not going to keep a journal. He's going to have to be forced. And I was. So I open it up, and first page it says, when I get old, I gotta climb Mount Everest, swim the English Channel. And to this day, I can't
Mhm.
mention it, Jeffrey, without just goosebumps because just this electric shock went through me, and it was like, I'd forgotten that boy. Because growing up with my parents, I never wanted to live inside. My dad had made so many good friends in the climbing community that we knew some National Geographic sponsored climbers, and man, that sounded like a good gig to me. So that's what I was going to be when I was a kid, and this wild adventurer. And I'd forgotten about that boy and what his dreams were. And immediately it hit me. Okay, my immune system's so suppressed. I know it probably wouldn't handle elevation. I don't have any money because I just spent over $300,000 out of pocket on medical bills. So I'm broke. So, but I can swim the channel. I don't know why I thought I'd go, but and so I called up Aaron Waters, my doctor friend, who just walked me through this whole process. He's like, "Are you kidding me?" He's like, "Not only no, but hell no." You get in a public pool, your immune system's so bad, it'll kill you. And I said, "No, what do you want me to do? Die sitting on a couch watching TV? I'm not going to go out that way. I'm going to die swinging for the fence." And he's like, "Okay, well, if you got to do it, would you at least please wear a nose plug? It'll make you look like an idiot, but at least it'll keep the water from going up into your nose and going through your membranes into your brain. So you'll have a best chance to, and then as soon as you get out, wash, scrub your body down, really take extra precautions." I'm like, I can do that. And so that's what I did. The very next day, I got into the pool and started swimming.
That's amazing. You know, there's so much to that it's about living. It's about life. You know, we get programmed as children to give up those hopes and dreams. That's unrealistic. You know, get in the real world. Come back into reality, and go work this 9 to 5, or in your case, good God, how many hours you were working. It's like there's nothing living about that.
Right.
And then through all that, eat this processed garbage food. And if you get some sniffles, go to the doctor and they'll give you some drugs, and we'll manage your symptoms that way. But none of this is living. And it's, as I listened to your conversation with Dr. Seeger, and then I looked through some comments, I was wondering how I would be able to bring this in, but I'll bring it in now.
Please.
And it makes sense to me on some level. There's people out there that just can't bring themselves to believe a story like this. And I think it's probably their little child within them, the dreamer within them, was so destroyed that they want to bring everybody back to reality and say, there's no way you did what you did. They're naysayers, they're doubters, and it may come across as though they're being hateful or hurtful towards you. But the way I see that is they have so much hurt within them that they can't even perceive a chance of choosing to do something different and stepping outside of the norm and going to take on a challenge like that. So I guess prior to us getting into further details of your story, which I definitely want to get into all of that, what is your response to the doubters, the naysayers? Like, what is your reaction when you hear something like that?
Yeah, it was shocking at first because in real life, people know me and know that I'm not a big talker and that you can trust what I say. And I'd never really had a ton of media exposure where it was a two-way conversation. And when I started getting a few viral posts, and hundreds of thousands of people are commenting and that sort of thing, and I started getting a lot of what I'd call hate mail, and people actually cussing at me, calling me an MFer, and that I'm killing people, and it was really shocking at first. But like you, I wounded people wound others, and everybody's got a cancer story or somebody they know that's died of cancer, and our our culture in particular has been so whitewashed from the process of death that we think of it as a failure or something we shouldn't talk about or something that will never happen to us in particular. People have a really odd reaction to death, and don't see it as a part of life, because it's we've been so removed from that. And so I think people are fighting against their own mortality. And then also, uh, either they've had a cancer experience and a good doctor that helped them, and they used allopathic treatment and it got them better. And so they
Mhm.
can't imagine that there might have been a better way since they went into remission. And they don't want to, their ego doesn't want to consider that maybe they didn't have to do all that chemo and radiation, or they just lost a loved one like I did and are in torment, and they make the mistake of thinking I said that any of my process or story was easy, and that I just kind of danced
Mhm.
my way through it, and irresponsibly told doctors no. And that's so most folks are working out of ignorance or deep wounds. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
that's
that's
how I
absolutely my
that's
sense.
how I'd look at it. Either that or they're total assholes.
Yeah.
And so I'd rather
Fair.
go with
There's
I'd
some of
rather
them, let's
go
be
with
honest.
I'd rather go with scared and wounded than just total asshole.
Like, absolutely right.
Yeah.
No, I'm with you there, and that answer doesn't surprise me at all. But I couldn't. I really needed to ask you that because that was the sense that I got. I mean, it hurt me in listening to your story and knowing the outcome and all this stuff. Like that's so motivating. That should save lives. And there's people out there that are thinking you're killing people. Like that's heartbreaking to me that that's the way they're wired and programmed and indoctrinated. Like yeah, I mean, as you said, it wasn't easy, and it may not be the path for everyone. But I guess the other question I have now is, as you alluded to earlier, you said allopathic medicine says that CLL cannot be cured.
Right.
It can't get you can't get rid of it. You can just get
Right.
your levels low enough to say that, oh, we don't see it now, but you still got it somewhere. I mean, listen, it's like the 4 minute mile, right? Roger Bannister. It has to happen once, and then we see it can be done, and then
Right.
we can believe it and study it, and now it happens more and more. And that's so much the sense that I have. I told my doctor, as crazy as it sounds, I said, I know this is going to sound wild, but I'm going to say it anyway. I said, I actually think I manifested this.
Oh
The
wow.
number of stories I've heard or read of people who have healed themselves without any standard of care allopathic treatment. And many of them are, the oncologists themselves who, when
Hmm.
they're diagnosed, they don't go through standard of care and
Right.
they recover. So and the only way I can convey that story to people without just being, a contrarian is to live it and prove it. And
Right.
it feels like that's what this timeline that I'm on right now. I've created that environment for myself. And man, just like yourself, I see that happening. And whether we're going to call it easy, hard, whatever, it's my path and it's my purpose. And I know it's coming, so
Right.
it's something I welcome, whether I wish it upon anybody else or not. Of course I don't, but
Right.
if you living your story and journey and me living mine and those of us that have a similar mindset, as you alluded to before with stubbornness, call it what you will, right? Yeah, I've got a touch of that. I was that one in my family, middle child and stubborn and set in my ways. But when you have the right information backing you, it can really serve its purpose. So
Well, and I'd
that
read
brings us then
so
to
much about mind body medicine from Dr. Herbert Benson and Lipton and
yeah,
all of the greats, Beckwith.
yep,
There to
and
me, if our body created it, our body can heal it. I look at it in
yes,
two
sir.
ways. One, we're just poisoned. We're in a bad environment, kind of like what happened to my wife. She had this cute story, and we just thought it was the funniest thing ever. Her uncle had a huge wheat farm, and he would have her and her cousin stand out at about 5 or 6 years old, holding the flags for the crop dusters. And then for the rest of the day, they'd play what they called snowman, because the crop dusters would go right over them and they'd be pasted white with DDT, and they thought it looked funny. So rather than go and wash it off, they'd play around and dance around and act like Frosty the Snowman. When she got
Wow.
sick, that story became much less funny. But so there are people like her that just get poisoned. But then there are others like me that have been working too hard and making wrong choices. And then I'd been working, I specialized in sexual trauma for the 10 years previous. And so I was hearing 40 or more rape, molestation, and incest stories firsthand every day, all day, or every week anyway.
Mm.
And I wasn't having enough uh, conscientious consideration for how much secondhand trauma I was absorbing, and how just as a human animal, I'm pulling that in and it's knotting up my body as well. So
Of
I think
course.
I think that's a lot of it for
Yeah.
me. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a big one. I mean, that's not to get too far off topic of your story, but maybe this is a part of it. I mean, that makes me think about all therapists that if you don't have your own practice of how to kind of let all that off, or better yet, maybe thinking about it in terms of a way of having a field of sorts to protect you, not in order to help heal somebody, we don't need to take on their burden. We just
Right.
need to help them discover how to offload it and disconnect from it, and take that emotion away from the experience and so on. But that can absolutely lead to all sorts of ailments for the practitioner in that scenario.
Oh,
uh,
certainly.
Knowing you still practice now, do you have a specific approach to how you prevent that from happening at
Oh
this
yeah.
stage?
I start every day with a cold plunge and a time of meditation. And then I try to stop 5 to 10. The clinical hour is only supposed to be 50 minutes long. And I always used to use that for
Yeah.
paperwork. I still kind of do, but mostly, depending on how intense the session was and how much I felt like I absorbed or was locked on to them, which I try to, give everybody equal attention of loving kindness. And so many times, almost errantly, man, I'm living it right there with them. I will then
Yeah.
take a time of meditation and breathing where I just imagine holding them in light. And then I say to God or the universe, whatever you want to call it, hey, I've loved them. I've done that. I've done my best, but they are not mine. They're yours. I'm giving them back to you. And so I do that and give the energy back then as well. And that's helped dramatically. But then also, I try to, this time of year, it's a little more difficult because the river water is down to 38 degrees now. So it's hard. I've got a wetsuit that can handle it, but when your face
Mhm.
freezes to your goggles, it makes it a little more complicated. But typically, I swim in just this beautiful, pristine, and clear river every day. So I'm grounding and I'm getting a nature experience, kind of washing it off of me. And then the end of my story that we haven't gotten to, that I'll tell sometime, is that after the leukemia went away, the leukemia went away, the lymphoma got aggressive. And so I started
Yeah.
searching for ways that nature has healed lymphoma. And I found Dr. King Lee from Nippon University. He took several groups of 50 men who had cancer, and he'd take them out into the forest to do forest bathing. And he found that just 1 to 2 hours of being in the forest, mindful and meditating, would boost their immune system anywhere from 50 times to 300 times for a period of 2 weeks.
Wow.
And so I thought, okay, if they're going out for an hour every 2 weeks, and this is lasting for 2 weeks, if I go out for a full day every week, it'll become exponential. And I started that when they wanted me to do chemo and radiation for my lymphoma in 2015. Started that in May. And by March of 2016, my lymphoma was gone. And I thought once I went into remission, I'd probably quit that practice, but it became such a sweet kind of sacred communion with nature that to this day, 9 years later, I'm still doing it every Friday. And I make my practice so that by Friday I'm done, and I spend the whole day out in the wilderness with my backpack and hammock, sleeping, reading, praying, meditating, and then I'll end with a cold dip in a glacial stream. And this last Friday, it was 29 degrees, the coldest in nine
Ooh,
years. It's
wow.
never gotten that cold. And man, it was brutal,
Wow.
but it was glorious. And I walk out of there feeling like a brand new human being. I literally am so rejuvenated. I feel reborn. And that's really what I want for you and all your listeners and everyone on earth. That wild cure is there. And we don't, do you have to do it my way? Absolutely not. You know, a little old lady's not going to go hiking out into the forest where bears and mountain lions are, but she could garden and would love to. I've got several artist friends that will go and do what they call plein air painting and drawing. They'll go out in the weather and do their art. There's all sorts of ways to commune with nature, and that's really what my mission and my message is now. I'm developing a whole new type of therapy I call Natura, nature adaptive therapy, unifying rewilding and AI. I've developed a personality
Hmm.
type test because we all have a different approach and a different preference to what we like and don't like. And combine that with a self report fitness test, and you'll fall into one of 7 profiles. And then I'll use that percentage of profiles, that unique mixture, to then suggest different rewilding strategies that would fit your personality and preferences and fitness. And then I have AI analyze within a 50-mile radius your residence and where you can go and do those strategies. Because the most frequent DM I get now is, Dean, it's easy for you. You live in a beautiful place. But the
Hmm.
earth is a beautiful place, and you can find beauty wherever you're at. So that's kind
Amen.
of where I'm at and what I'm really excited about now, because I'm finding time and again, the more you connect with nature, the lower your stress, anxiety starts to dry up and go away, depression starts to lessen, grief. I don't think anyone should try to do grief outside of the trees, definitely not in a therapist's office. Um, I cried myself. I hate to, my masculine boomer self hates admitting this, but uh, I cried myself to sleep many times for 3.5 years after my wife died. I never woke up crying. But when I started going out to the
Hmm.
forest, I'd be in the hammock by 9:30, 10 o'clock, and every time, Jeffrey, about 1 a.m., 2 a.m., I'd wake up just sobbing. And that had never happened in my whole grief process. And the way I think about it and what we know about trees now, they're literally antennae, and they create a force field of magnetic resonance from the center of the earth. And so I literally think of it as pulling out anything that is not me. And that's why I'd wake up crying. And since I was out in the middle of the forest and there was nobody around, if Bigfoot heard me cry, maybe that's okay. I don't know.
Well,
But
I tell you what, though, that's beautiful, man. And there's something to it, So I am a few years younger, but there's something about me that I've stepped into the older I've gotten. I knew it of me as a child, but I never learned how to cultivate it. So I, in a sense, almost was in denial of it and would mask it. I'm
right,
super sensitive, super emotional.
right,
Although I'm a a masculine guy. In the fitness industry, personal trainer. I've done some bodybuilding, played football, wrestled, all that type of stuff. I've also got that feminine quality of the emotion, of the sensitivity. And I mean, I say that with a sense of the utmost pride. I'm
Sure.
so grateful for it at this stage of life because I've cultivated that to become a superpower of mine.
Right.
And, there's something to it. I appreciate the perspective you say as the boomer in you, that type of thing, because there's a generational component there that it was taught and almost forced upon us that tough men, real men don't cry.
Right.
And listen, when we bottle up those emotions and we keep pushing them down deeper and pushing them down deeper, where do we think the disease is coming from? We have to find a
Exactly.
way to let it out. And it's a wonderful way to share with people that, okay, maybe you still don't feel comfortable expressing those emotions in a group setting or in front of anybody for that matter, but go
Right.
out into nature, go out amongst the trees and let nature heal you. Your story is really, it highlights all the stuff that I've been studying recently, this whole quantum biology
Hmm.
movement of
Hmm.
ultimately nature heals,
Right.
this the light water magnetism, as Dr. Jack Kruse says, and really leveraging all of that. You lived it firsthand, whether you called it that type of stuff or not, for the movement with the swimming, the cold with the water, the grounding with the
Right.
water, with this
Right.
living water, the river. The
Hmm.
sun was on you, or maybe not a lot of sun. There were some rainy days too, but you were
Yeah.
still getting the natural full spectrum of the sun on you
Right.
for 3 straight weeks with your swim. That all played such a massive role in this. And your mindset, your determination, your drive to keep pushing through as hard as it was. I mean, I know your training took quite a bit of time, so I don't want to gloss over that. If you want to go
Sure.
through that, we can certainly do that as well. But you know, with the swim happening and that first impact on your hip, man, that I felt that pain as I read that in the book of just starting to swim out and you slam your hip on a rock. I'm like, oh shit, he's starting out as if this isn't hard enough. He's already got 2 forms of cancer and he's trying to do something nobody's ever done before and slams his hip. Man, between that, the eagles that were flying overhead and
Mm.
following you, like I I experienced it with you in reading this book. I'm so grateful you guys put pen to paper and did this project and shared it with all of us. So
Well, thank you,
thank you
Jeffrey.
for that. But
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
course, man,
It
there's
was
something
just
special here
such an
for sure.
adventure. And I was really, even though I'd been a therapist and loved mind body medicine, back 10 years ago, we just didn't know what we know now about biomechanics and the quantum field and everything that's happening in nature. I was just trying to live out this dream that had started 30 years earlier when I was 24. I had been standing on the banks of the Willamette after a bicycle race. I'd come out for a bicycle race and I'd done pretty well. For me, I mean, there were about 600 in the race and I ended up 15th, which, that's no podium. But for me, I was pretty happy. And
That's
my
awesome.
family, being my family, threw me a big celebration picnic at this park on the Willamette. Well, in the 60s and 70s, the Willamette had just been an oil slick. It had been so polluted, but we put a lot of environmental protection things in place. And I hadn't been around and I'd come back for this race. And so this was 1984. And I was looking at this beautiful river that I'd been born only 4 blocks away from, and we just thought of it as a sewer, but now it was big and blue and beautiful and clean and clear, and there were waterfowl playing and all sorts of flora and fauna, and I just thought it was the most glorious looking thing I'd ever seen. And I looked over at my great adventurer dad and thought I'd impress him and said, "Hey, has anybody ever swum this whole thing?" Thinking he'd be like, "Hey, that's my boy." And instead he said, "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Where do you come up with this crap?" Well, that was almost like a salvo across the bow. Now I had to prove him wrong. But I gave it up because I was 24 and it would have required 3 or 4 weeks not working and we were saving money to buy a house. And so it just didn't make sense.
Mhm.
And so, like you were saying, in an effort to be responsible, we work ourselves to death, give up our dreams, and cease to live. And I believe that each one of us, kind of alluding to kind of that Beckwithian philosophy, we come into this world with a dream, like an instinct of a goose to fly south for the winter. And Jeffrey's dream's not Dean's dream. But this was Dean's
Mhm.
dream, and it had sat there dormant for 30 years, but then came back. And when you have the courage to recover your dreams and follow them, then you meet the people you're supposed to meet, do the things you're supposed to do, and become the person you're supposed to be. And that's certainly what happened for me. As a matter of fact, swimming, I was going down to the University of California, San Diego, to the world's number 3 in chronic lymphocytic leukemia, Dr. Juanerio Castro. And both of us thought that there was probably a pretty good chance that this swim would kill me. It'd be so hard and so long, it would just wear me down. I, in my heart, didn't feel that way, but we never, everybody's like, hey, how did you know cold water immersion would heal you? And I'm like, I didn't. As a matter of fact, when I got in the Willamette, I saw it kind of like my parents see nature, that it's recreational and beautiful. And I called it the Willamette River. After a few days feeling its current and its flow and kind of dancing with it as I swam, it became Big Blue. But then on day 6,
Hmm.
that whole experience with the eagles, for your listeners, what had happened was we went through this passage, this beautiful wild passage of the river that was pretty much just a corridor of 100-foot Douglas fir trees, and there was a male and female eagle roosting, and Dad and the other kayakers stopped me and said, "Hey, look at those eagles." So I looked up as I passed them, and they all joked that, "Hey, what if they swoop down and think you're a big piece of meat or something?" And I said, "Well, that would be interesting." But kept swimming, and as soon as I passed them, they took off from their roost and circled me. And I thought, well, that's cool, almost
Hmm.
like a Native American blessing, because a lot of Native American or indigenous tribes believe that when eagles circle you, it's a blessing. And so, having lived in Kansas, I'd known that. And I thought, well, that's cool. But then when I stopped, they'd roost. And then when I'd start, they'd circle me. And this went on for over 3 hours. It was the most magical
Hmm.
thing for all of us. It was just like, how does this kind of stuff happen? And so on that day, I became even more in tune with the river. And as hippy dippy as it sounds, I started hearing her. I started feeling her, and she was comforting me like a wise old mother, and she was just kind of holding me in her arms as we'd moved together, and whispering things that I needed to hear. And I can't believe I'm even saying that aloud because it sounds so goofy, but that's honestly what I experienced. And so from then on, it became Mama River. And what I've experienced in my deeper connection with nature is very much like indigenous cultures. Our Western culture puts us in at the top of the pyramid of nature, and we're lords over all, and we're in dominion over all other creatures. And I think that's such egotistical nonsense now. It's not even funny. I don't think I'm any better than a tree or a rock or a fish. It is another being on this earth. And when
Hmm.
the beauty of pulling yourself off of that pedestal is then you have a deep respect for everything and everyone. And so when I get this, just vehement kind of toxic backlash, I see it as the result of a toxic culture, trying to keep us enslaved and imprisoned and away from our natural way of living and being. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I tell you what, I don't, I forget the term you just used, but the fact that you say that out loud about the Mama River talking to you that way, I find that absolutely beautiful. And it really resonates with me because in my meditative practice, I'll come out of a meditation and I'll start journaling and there's poetry flowing out of me and I feel like I'm channeling it. I don't think it's
Right.
me.
Right.
And I've written 3 books that way,
Wow.
that the reason I felt comfortable writing them is because I didn't feel I did it. I felt like it was being done through me. So I was supposed to share it and there was no ego behind it. It was, all right, well, this is the poetry. I referred to them as a collection of meditative poems, but it's exactly how it came. As you said, you heard it, you felt that, and she was protecting you, she was communicating through you, and man, this is what living is about.
It really is,
As you
Jeffrey.
said.
It really is. And I want everyone in their own way to get that same experience. It was one of the most incredible adventures I'd ever been on, but not the kind of adventure I expected. What I loved most about it is the first 100 days, 100 miles, no one took us seriously. I mean, here's a 54-year-old man,
Mm,
never been on a swim team, never won a swim race, trying to do something no one in history has ever done before. And, he's 54, has 2 forms of cancer. It kind of looked sad and pathetic and like a death wish wish. And so the media didn't want any part of it. But once I crossed the 100-mile mark, they're like, whoa, this might have a happy ending. And so it just built and built and built. And those last several days I just adored, because people would come to the river, and either where I'd start or where I'd finish, or even in between, or meet me on a boat and stop. And those last 16 or so days took quite a bit longer because I was getting stopped frequently.
mm,
But what I learned quickly is I was achieving my purpose. I was inspiring them, and I didn't have. The beautiful thing is the gift from Mama River and how she was speaking through me is I didn't have to say a word. They'd come up and they just want me to hug them, and they'd cry and tell me their
mm.
story. And I could tell they'd leave feeling better, having been down to the river, having met me, and I didn't say a thing. It was the most organic. I've never thought of myself as a minister, but it was the most organic form of ministry I've ever experienced, because it was just pure love. And it, yeah, they weren't, fangirling me at all. They were my dad a little
Mhm.
bit. He kind of became a media. He's super crusty, and he loves to talk, and he's got a crazy spin on everything. And man, he loved being in front of the camera. I kind of shied away from it as much as possible. And just after a while, hey, there's Dad, and got him to talking, and they'd get so enamored with him, I just go and hug people. But it was one of the
That's
sweetest
awesome.
journeys I'd ever had. Yeah.
That's incredible. I mean, that the energy exchange that you're saying, just a hug and they felt it and you weren't even speaking. There's just something so powerful in that when we recognize that at its simplest form, we just are energetic beings.
Right.
There's an aspect of that I won't pretend to be intelligent enough to give the explanation of what that is, but I feel it, I believe it, it resonates with me, and I hear far, you know, more brilliant people than I explain it, and it just makes sense. But I laugh that Dad talks as much as he does. I'm reading through the book, and he's talking about, yeah, I don't get as sensitive as Dean, and have all those, whatever term he used,
Yeah.
flowery words, what have you. He's like, I'm a rock. I'm very stern about it. So I could just see that dynamic playing out. But I can resonate far more with your approach to it, and
Sure.
it's there's something incredible about it. So you alluded to already the 100-mile mark. Just to give the audience
Mhm.
an idea, the full length of the Willamette is 187 miles you
Right.
swam.
Right. Yeah, I average
God,
10
man,
to 12 miles a day in 40-degree water. It's so funny, Jeffrey. The first few speeches I gave, I would give two things happened. I give question and answer times after them. And almost always some sweet little old lady would raise her hand. She goes, "Oh, wasn't that just so fun?" I'm like, um, no offense, but I was swimming equal to a little over 3 marathons a day. I've got cancer. It was freezing. Many times it was pouring down rain, and I did it for 22 days in a row. What about that sounds fun? um,
that's amazing.
uh, and the other thing that people would usually do, and it started hurting my feelings. They would raise their hand. And they'd say, "Dean, I thought you'd be bigger. Dean, I thought you'd be stronger looking. Dean, I thought you'd look more athletic." And so after the third or fourth time that happened, I called up my dad. I'm like, "Man, I didn't think of myself as a weenie. I've always been pretty athletic. What's happening here?" And he started laughing. He's like, "Exactly what you want." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "What they're saying is, Dean, you look like us. You're giving us hope."
Yeah,
And I thought, "Oh, you're so
yeah.
right.
Oh, that's
You're so
incredible.
right." Yeah.
Oh, you got to love that perspective because that's it. I understand it. Your ego was like, wait a minute, why are they mocking me? Because
I'm
they
six
heard
one
you
for
story
God's
like
sake.
that.
You know?
Right?
At that
You
time, I had
must be
6% body
superhuman,
fat. I'm like, come on.
man. Absolutely. But that's exactly it. They're expecting to see something in you that they can't relate to. And then they're
Right,
seeing that, oh, he is one of us. Like
right,
that's the thing, man. When I tell my story of any change that I've made in my life, because I used to be a punk little kid that made stupid decisions that would feel like a victim in certain scenarios until I grew up and recognized that I was responsible for it. I created the reality that I was living in. I wasn't a victim, and I started to make changes. And as I made those changes, my life began to change and get better. And
right.
it started to feel like, whoa, we are the creator.
Yeah,
When I tell those stories to people, I want it to be delivered in a way that I'm not patting myself on the back. I'm recognizing that, holy shit, this stuff works. If
right.
I can do it, anybody can do it. Just get your head out of your ass, stop making excuses, and go do it. Now, what you did is a whole nother level than that, but similar premise of just
Totally.
give the example, give the 4 minute mile, and say, here you go. Who's next?
Right, right. Yeah. I might not
Oh
include the
man,
head out of your ass part. I might think it, but yeah,
that's
I
right.
tell
I'm
everybody that
talking to myself.
that I'm entirely ordinary. If you just do what I did, you'll get what I got and probably better because I'm no big deal. And I'm more than happy to live like that. I think anything else just is disingenuous. As a matter of fact, I really appreciate the accolades you gave my daughter Brie in her writing. We tried 3 different iterations of my book, and I developed an allergic reaction emotionally to each one of them because it just sounded like I was bragging. And then she found this
Yeah,
what's called threaded narrative, where she'd interview each person and then break up the interviews and weave them together to create the narrative because we were all on this journey. We were all having this adventure. And then all of a sudden, it's everybody telling this story. And it's not just me saying, it can I love the book in that I don't think it can ever be mistaken for me just pounding on my chest and saying, look at me and what a big deal I am. And I've never, even when
absolutely.
nobody's been terribly unkind, but even those that haven't liked it as much didn't say that. So that was what we wanted to accomplish more than anything with that was help people to realize that nature cures, and that if they follow their dream like I followed mine, they'll life will take a hand and find a way.
So true. So true. And the other part going through my mind is at the end of the book where you were all talking regarding, and it may have been like you just described, you weren't actually in a room together talking, but everyone's take on what cold exposure and, cold submersion does for everybody, or it did for everybody. When Bree was talking, and I think Dr. Seeger mentioned this as well, that there was that level of grief, and that the grief was creating this sense of the shiver, but it wasn't shiver, it was more tremors, and it was more the grief and anxiety working its way out through the cold. Never heard it that way before. And then Bree was saying, oh, I can absolutely relate. All of her grief built up from mom passing, and she was able to get that experience and work that out. I think that's so incredibly powerful. And to give us that distinction between, when we haven't yet become cold adapted, we'll get the shiver. But once we get cold adapted, we've built up our brown fat, then we can get that shiverless warming up, because the mitochondria and the brown fat is creating that infrared light. That's creating the heat and warming us up. But once you've gotten further into it, like Dr. Seeger has, and he knows, well, wait a minute, why am I shivering? I've got plenty of brown fat. And it isn't shiver so much as that tremor from that emotion, the anxiety. That's so incredibly powerful. The end, I did not expect to be getting that at the end of the book, and I was so excited getting to the end. And actually, I was almost disappointed, to be totally honest, when the end of the swim came. I'm like, well, now that means the book's coming to an end. I know you
Oh,
finished
thank
it, and
you.
I know there's a
Yeah,
successful story at the end of it. But it's just such a moving story that, man, I know this is what you want from it, but I really pray that people get the message and don't view it, because reading the book, it didn't even once come across of you puffing your chest out and bragging at all. It's
good, good.
leading by example, sharing your story. And you knew there, as you talked about, there's a chance that along the way, I might not make it.
Right,
And damn it, I'd rather go that way
right.
than go sitting on a couch watching TV. And boy, does that resonate with me, And I do. I just pray that people get that message, and hopefully don't wait for their diagnosis. They actually
Right.
start living before it takes a kick in the
Absolutely.
pants to do it. You know?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
Because there are tiny little kicks in the pants like stress, anxiety, lethargy, malaise, mild depression. All of those are, the warning light on the dashboard of your life saying, hey, you need to get two things. You need to start recovering your dreams and following those and really living, like you said. And you need to quit living in your own zoo and get out and become a wild human again. Yeah.
yeah, man. I'm right there with you, and I love it. Your story is just moving, doesn't do it justice, but I'll say it moved me. I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful you're here and in the picture of health now at this point. And
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah,
thank you, man.
thankfully. And thank you,
Now,
Jeffrey, for reading the book and having such an organic, thoughtful discussion about it. You've brought up points that I've done over 300 podcasts since 2018, and you've brought up points and nuanced parts of that story that most people have never mentioned. So I appreciate your thoughtful approach to this discussion.
absolutely, man. Yeah, it's powerful because it does it. I can relate in so many ways, and this was special. I'm grateful for your time. Now, you touched upon a couple of the different programs that you'll be
Mhm.
working on. Are these things that people can reach out and connect with you now and get started if
Absolutely.
they're
Yeah,
motivated to?
I'm starting well, if they want to know, I've had so many people recently ask about my cold water protocol or forced bathing. I've
Mhm.
got both. You can get if you just get on my website and put wild into it, you'll get my cold water protocol. If you get on my website and sign up for my newsletter, you can also get a free ebook on forest bathing and my approach to it. But from now till December 31st, really first of the year sometime, I'm doing what I call my December bonus collection. I'm taking my first 10 clients for Natura and helping them to tailor make a rewilding or reconnection approach, and then coaching them through it for 12 weeks. And I'm only going to take 10 this first time, but I'm really excited about it because I was just wanted to see how my evaluation stood up against all the world's wellness evaluations. So I got on ChatGPT and I copied and pasted my whole evaluation in and talked a little bit about it and said, please compare this to the best wellness evaluations in the world. What do I need to do to make it as good or better? And ChatGPT, now this might sound like I'm puffing out my chest. Please don't hear it that way. I was shocked. But ChatGPT says, I cannot compare this to other wellness evaluations because it is better, more complete, more comprehensive, and you are pioneering a new field. And my first thought, I get so tired of salespeople and marketers that BS me. I'm like, oh, that's such a load of. Wait a minute, couldn't be BS because it's a computer. So I was pretty
Yeah,
excited that I'm pioneering this new way to help everybody find out exactly what, according to their personality, preference, and fitness and geography, how they best can start reconnecting with nature in ways that make sense to them, just like I do in ways that have changed my life. Yeah.
that's incredible. I don't, I can't think of a single person that wouldn't benefit from that. And man, I hope people get all over that. And
Yeah,
you
me
know,
too.
there's always going to be some little spin-offs and people trying their own approach to it, and that's cool too. You know, right? Is what is it? What's that term? So oh, I'm drawing a blank right now. When people essentially rip off your idea,
Oh,
it's
sure.
flattering. You know,
Sure.
they're
Yeah.
not going to be able to do it to your extent, but
Right.
you know, that's wonderful. So
Yeah.
yeah, man, this was incredible. I feel like I could talk to you for days and just keep going on and on, but I
Yeah,
won't
it would
take your
be
time
fun.
too much longer.
Well, maybe we have to do a part
This
two
was fantastic.
sometime.
I would love that. I would love that. Yeah, there's already ideas spinning right now, so I'll take you up on that at some point.
Okay. Well,
But
thank you
until
so
then,
much, Jeffrey, for
thank you
having
for
me
your
on.
time.
Thank you.
Truly my pleasure, man. And audience, thanks so much for sticking around. You know the drill. Subscribe, hit that notification bell, like, comment, share, all that good stuff, and be sure to go over and subscribe to everything of Dean's as well, and check out his website. And till next time, have a blessed day, everyone.